Hello and welcome to the MESAM podcast. This is the podcast where we talk to MESAM members and associates about their current or recent research into the medieval world of Central Europe. I'm Karen Culver, and today it is my pleasure to be back in Budapest in the CEU campus and meeting with Dorottya Uhrin to talk about her ongoing research into St Emeric and his chaste marriage. Dorottya has studied at Eötvös Loránd University, ELTE, in Budapest for a number of years. She started with 2 BA degrees, one in history and religious studies, the other in Mongolian language and Buddhism. She followed this with an MA in medieval history, followed by her PhD, where her thesis was on medieval Hungarian cult of the Virgin Capitalis. She also has an MA in medieval studies from the Central European universities, where we were contemporaries.
Yes.
Staying at ELTE between 2018 and 21, she was a research fellow working on a project about the Mongolian invasions of Hungary. And she is now an assistant professor at ELTE in the medieval history department. Her current research focuses on medieval church history and medieval religiosity. Her specific interest are the ordeals, the cult of saints, and the Mongol invasion of Europe. She is the secretary of the Hungarian Association for Hagiographical Studies and a review editor of the Historical Studies on Central Europe. Besides her publications, she frequently organises and attends national and international conferences and edits books. Dori also loves hiking, but with 2 young twin boys who are too young to hike and too heavy to carry far, her hiking trips are temporarily much shorter. She enjoys cooking and inventing new dishes and has a small garden planted in a way that offers fresh fruit or vegetables all year round. And that takes some doing, I know. Dori, welcome to the MESAM podcast.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
You're very welcome. It's a joy to be back with you again. Now, Emeric. I know that he was the son of King Istvan I of Hungary. Apart from dying young, what do we know of Emeric's life?
Well, basically this. We don't really know much about the life of St Emeric. This is an early 11th century history, and sadly, the sources are very limited for that time. We know that King Stephen I, who is the founder of the Hungarian state, had problem for producing heirs. He had many daughters. We knew that he had a son named Otto, who died early. But finally, Emeric was born, and he reached the adulthood. But he also died young. He was around 24 years old when he died in a hunting accident. We also know that his father made King of Mirrors, which gave him some idea how he should rule the kingdom. And we also know that he had a bride. But we are not really sure that he married. But different sources account different brides. So either the bride of Emeric was the daughter of the emperor of the Greeks, or the daughter of the Croatian king, or the daughter of the Polish king. We don't really know who she was and whether they married or they were just bride. And we didn't know that what happened after her. Also, in the Hungarian historiography, they suggest that probably he was the head of the guards in the kingdom. He must have trained to be a military, and he was prepared to rule the kingdom, which finally never happened. But basically, these are the information which we know about the life of Emeric.
I know when I read your paper, thinking that you referred to him as the Virgin Prince, my first reaction was, what is the point of a ruler, a monarch, in the early 11th century who doesn't have or doesn't try to get sons to go on ruling. And this is particularly relevant for the heirs of King Stephen, King Istvan, because there wasn't anyone else. I was just bemused to think that there's this young man who probably married, but apparently was a virgin. What use is that as a king?
Nothing. I have a vivid imagination, and I imagined that Emeric go to see his father and telling him that, yes, father, I know that you had huge battle for 30 years to stabilize the kingdom, but I want to live in virgin, so you won't have an heir. It never happened, and of course in the legend it was said that he kept it in secret, but it is very clear that the idea that the prince was virgin is a later imagination. And the only historical basis that he was virgin is the fact that he didn't have kids.
Ah. So when did these legends of Emeric emerge? How did they emerge? And why him?
So it's not only Emeric. It's a very interesting thing that in the first half of the 11th century, it happened with 3 ruler houses that they died without heirs. In the case of the Holy Roman Emperor Henry II, he lived in a long marriage with his wife Kunigund. And also happened with Edward the Confessor and with his wife Edith, who were married for 20 years and didn't produce an heir. And in the 11th and 12th century, the idea developed that they were virgin kings. But how this idea developed? It's a very complex question. Well, in the case of Saint Emeric, there are very few sources. We knew that he had a legend which written in the 12th century, and in this legend it was written that he lived in a marriage or he had a bride and he never touched his wife and lived in virginity in his marriage. But I think it would worth to speak a little bit about more that how the idea of this virginal marriage of Henry and Edward born, because we have much more sources. In the case of Henry, we knew that they were expecting heirs. They actually had a charter that when they admit that after 8 years of trying, they were unable to produce kids. So they accepted that they are barren and they put Christ as their heir. And we have other sources later. At the end of the 11th century, when they were not canonized yet, they were canonized much later than Emeric. Emeric was canonized in 1083. Henry was in the in 1146, and Edward the Confessor was in the 1160s. But in the case of Henry, in the late 11th century, there was a work written by Leo of Ostia, and he wrote that Henry's wife was a virgin, not Henry, but the wife.
You can't blame it on the husband. It has to be the wife. That was surely the way.
Yes, but, well, if your wife is a virgin, doesn't mean that you are.
Oh, absolutely.
It was just written that he agreed with this or respected this. He just accepted this and it was okay to him. And later, in the mid-12th century or in the early 13th century, it was the first hagiographical source when it was written that he was a virgin. And part of this because in the Christianity and in the hagiographical sources, the sexual status of the man was never really a question, and it was never the source, or was rarely the source of sanctity.
Well, I was going to ask that. Where did the idea that virginity, for male or female, where did the idea that virginity was holy come from? Particularly as my memory of church days, the Catholic Church, encourages people to have lots of children.
Yeah, I think it's a very complex question, and it goes back to the late antiquity, because being virgin is a kind of asceticism. And in the early days of Christianity, virginity was not a very important thing. I mean, they were persecuted by the Romans, and it was not the most important question. The question was who was the martyr. And in the early Christian church, there were many martyrs who were mothers or married and so on. One of the most famous early martyr act is the act of Perpetua and Felicitas. And Perpetua was a young mother, and Felicitas was pregnant. And in the early church, they esteemed more the mothers who were martyred because they gave up the family for the sake of Christianity. But after the church was established and the persecution were over and Christianity was the main religion of the Roman Empire, they had to find different ways to prove Christianity, and this was asceticism. And part of the asceticism is that you are not engaging in carnal love. So after there were no way to be persecuted and killed for Christianity and prove your faith with it, the asceticism became more and more important. In the early days of Christianity, for example, we know about many priests that they had wives, and we know about many monks who had wives. The most important order was the Benedictine order, and they shouldn't have wives. But we know that by the 9th century, in many cloisters, the Benedictine monks had wives, and the wives lived with them. And this why, for example, the Cluny reform and other reform movements came to light, because they wanted that the monks should live ascetic life again and life without marriages. So it was more important in the case of the monks to live in celibacy, but in the case of priests, it was not that important until the Gregorian movement. But with the Gregorian movement, it became very important that the priests should abandon their wife. But it was just in 1139 when in the Second Council of Lateran, they decided that the priests should abandon their wives and their marriages are invalid. Earlier, if a priest married before the ordination, they counted it illegal but valid. But from the mid-12th century, it became invalid. So they have to abandon the wives.
Coming back to Emeric, I understand that when he was canonized, the Pope was not involved. This was fairly normal in the early church. So what was the process by which Emeric was declared a saint? And weren't many other Hungarians declared saints at the same time?
Yes. So Stephen I was the one who established the Hungarian kingdom. And after his death, partly because Emeric died, Hungary wasn't very stable, and there were fights that who would be the king. Until the reign of Ladislas, who was later also venerated as a saint. But when Laszlo or Ladislas became ruler, he was not legitimate because, there was another king and Laszlo defeated him. And during the reign of László, he canonized the first king of Hungary who established the kingdom. So in 1083, there were the first canonization of Hungary. Firstly, in July, two saintly hermits were canonized in Nyitra. And after that, in 25 of July, another Hungarian martyr was canonized. He was Gerard of Csanád, who was killed in Budapest. There is our hill, the Gellért-hegy, and he was killed by pagans there. He was thrown to the Danube, and he was canonized, and he was and his legend was written around his canonization. But the hugest event in 83 was the canonization of Saint Stephen, the first Hungarian king. He was the one who Christianized the country and established the country, and there were miracles happened at his sepulchre, and many pilgrims came there, and he was canonized in 20th of August. It was almost 50 years or 40 years after his death. And he was canonized by Ladislas. And
how much of a political process was that? Yeah, I'm now the king of Hungary, and I will make a saint of the first king of Hungary. Is that promoting himself as well?
Yes. Gábor Klanicai wrote an excellent book about the ruler sense. Actually, King Stephen is probably the first king who was venerated as a saint because he established the Christianity and the kingdom. He was venerated because he was a good ruler. And, well, if we look back at the time, they could see that his age was a golden age. At least at the end of his ruling, there must have been some kind of peace. Looking back, they had a kind of nostalgia. So there must have been political intention by making him a saint. And as far as I told earlier, Ladislas' rulingship was illegitimate because there was a legitimately coronized king who was Solomon. And Solomon was in jail, and they opened the tomb of Stephen in the 15th of August, or tried to open, but they failed because Solomon was in jail. They had to free Solomon. Solomon left the country, and they could open the tomb. So it's a very beautiful picture, I think, and it's very symbolic that this is how Ladislav became the legitimate king and had the opportunity to Solomon to flee from the country. And he went to Istria and became a hermit, and later he had some local cult. After canonizing Saint Stephen in August, then in September the 2nd, they opened the tomb of Emeric, but he was only canonized in early November. And it's a question in the Hungarian historiography that why it takes 2 months to canonize him. And they believe that they were waiting probably for the miracles, but why it took for 2 months is we don't have so much sources.
2 months to go through canonization when you've got to have miracles and belief and a cult. 2 months is nothing.
Where ages ago when you asked the questions, you had
Yes.
So in this case, it was the decision of the Hungarian bishops because it was a totally different process. Now the Pope canonizing the saints, but it was in the early church when the cult of saints emerged. It was just local cult, and they started to venerate someone. And in the 8th century, they started to centralize the process. For example, we have capitularies from the Carolingian Empire that they shouldn't venerate a new relic without the agreement of the local prince or bishop. And from the 11th and 12th century, it was centralized that much that the Pope should agree. In the 11th and 12th century, the popes were eager that they should agree in all cases, but it wasn't, it was just their desire. And only from the 12th century we could say it was necessary that the Pope should agree. So in the case of Stephen and Emeric, the Pope must have been disagreed with this, because we have letters from the Pope later that he doesn't agree with the saintliness of Stephen.
I'm interested that you said the canonization had to be agreed by the prince or the bishop, as if they are equal in terms of making a saint.
Well, the head of the Hungarian church at that time was Saint Stephen. I mean, if we have a king, he had the right to name the bishops. And in the early time, the bishops had territories which was part of the kingdom, and the kings were always wanted to have decision in it. We knew that until the 12th century, when the bishops had local councils, the king participated in the decisions. So the church and the state was connected strongly. They were not independent from each other.
And I can see why the Pope was trying to get in to project his authority. Yeah, I can see that. The cult of Emeric, because we've hardly mentioned him, I presume he was popular. I presume he was highly venerated. Where is his cult based for pilgrimage?
So Emeric was buried to Székesfehérvár, where his father was also buried. And probably he was not popular at all, because his legend to remain chaste was not the topic which many people can agree. And in his legend, he was shown as a monk. And most probably, his legend was written to those who lived in a monastery. So he must be popular in monasteries. And I referred earlier that there were these three virgin king. So their legend, in the case of Henry and Edward, we are sure that their legend was produced in around the 11th or after the 1130s. And after that, they realized that this picture, the virginal king, is a rather strange one. And it wasn't popular at all later. So it was just a very short period when they invented this virginal king in the case when a king didn't have offspring. After that, they were not really venerated. We have similarities from 13th century. After the Franciscan and Dominican orders were established and they were popular in Eastern Europe, in the royal courts, they had so much impression on the princesses that they vowed to remain chaste. For example, in the case of Prince Koloman, who was the brother of Béla IV, and he had a wife, Salome, and we have the legend of Salome, who remained chaste in the marriage. And in this legend, Koloman was presented as someone who tried to block herself, and he was just a problem in the marriage. And also in the case of Saint Kunigunda, who was a Hungarian princess who married to Boleslav, the Polish prince, Boleslav was presented as someone who tried to sleep with his wife, of course, but King disagreed with it. And finally, of course, he respected what King Kunigunda asked from him, but they were rather presented as the blocks, not the heroes of celibacy. So it was a rather short-lived model of the kings, and it was not really popular at all. But in the case of Hungary, King Ladislas, who was later venerated as a saint, was highly popular. And the other Hungarian kings were not venerated as much among the Hungarians. So they were not that popular compared to, for example, St. Martin or St. Catherine or others.
Not even St. Stephen, St. Istvan, because he is very popular now.
Yes, he is very popular now. And most probably he had a pilgrimage site where miracles happened. Well, we knew the legend that, and after that legend, there were some miracles. And of course, he was popular, but I'm not sure that as much as today. And actually, we have the legend of Saint Emeric, and earlier I didn't finish a part, and probably I will finish it now, that we know from the legend of Saint Emeric that miracles happened. Miracles happened at his tomb, and I think that I told you earlier that his legend from the 12th century. But for me, it would be very strange that they wouldn't write a legend or something for 20 or 40 years. So I think that they collected the miracles firstly, the legend of Saint Emeric, and later when this idea came up that he was virgin, well, probably there were some rumors that he was virgin because he didn't have children, so probably there were some rumors. But it was in the 12th century when it was clearly written down that he lived in a virginal marriage or in a chaste marriage.
And it was the monks who wrote this down? The monks created this legend?
Yes, probably this legend was written in Pannonhalma, which was the most prominent monastery of Hungary. And recently there was a wonderful presentation of László Veszprémi, who dealt with a similar topic. And he had the idea that after Emeric died, and he died in a hunting accident, which was a very bad omen. And even worse, the only heir of the kingdom. So he had the idea that probably the monks and the churchmen near to the court came up with the idea after the death of Emeric that he lived a saintly life and a virginal life because they somehow wanted to stop these bad omens and turn the bad omen to a good omen. That, of course, he died, but he already joined the saints and he had this rumor that he lived a saintly life. But presenting a prince, an heir, a virgin was a very strange thing by that time. So it took a century to write it down as a legend.
Yeah, I can believe that because, as I said earlier, the one thing a monarch and the heir of a monarch is obliged to do is produce an heir. Just that. It's easy.
Yes, and of course rule fairly. But there is a very interesting thing in the case of Henry and Edward, because there are much more sources, and we knew that probably their wives were the ones who started to spread the rumors that their husband were the reason why they didn't produce an heir. And they were not the ones who were the barons, but their husband were the ones who didn't touch them. And they were not responsible for the war after the death of the emperor. In the case of the wife of Edward, the wife was called Edith. He ordered a book which is called Vita Edwardi Regis, where it was written that he lived a celibate life, But in here, celibacy doesn't necessarily mean virginity. It can mean marital fidelity. And in the later part of the work, it was written that their relationship was not really like a husband and wife, but father and mother. Edward was actually 20 years older than Edith. And interestingly, there are sources which suggest that Edith was probably pregnant, but they were not able to produce offspring because they died in her womb. So, and in the modern world, they still almost always blame the women for not producing heir.
Of course, yes.
And I think in the Middle Ages, it must have been worse.
Oh, it must have been much, much worse. If you can't have a child, it's your wife's problem. So get rid of the wife and find another one.
Yes, and there was a part during the marriage of Edward and Edith when Edward sent Edith to a nunnery, and historians assume that probably he wanted to have another wife. But maybe, it's a much more complicated question. But probably after the death of the kings, when many people blamed the queen that she didn't produce an heir, the queens started to spread rumors, but it's not my fault.
Yes, yeah, I can see that one, yeah. Which then would help her if she wished to remarry.
Yeah, it shouldn't be the opportunity for Edith, the wife of Edward the Confessor, because he was around 40 by that time when his husband died. And no one would marry a 40-year-old woman who didn't have kids.
Yeah, that's true.
And he didn't have the choice to remarry again, but she somehow wanted to save herself. Kunigunda was also older when Henry died, and probably, we don't really know in this case because we have later sources, but it seems that they somehow started to save the reputation of Kunigunda. But in the case of Emeric, since he was very young, 24 years old when he died, and actually he was named after Henry II. Henry and Emeric is the same name.
Ah.
In the earlier hagiographical sources, he was named as Henricus. And I mentioned in the first part of my talk that the brother of Henry was Otto. He was also named of the Holy Roman Emperor because when he was born, the emperor was Otto. And when our Henricus Emeric was born, the emperor was Henry II. So it's very interesting that there were similarity in their lives. There are other similarity in their legend as well. But we don't really know anything about the wife of Emeric. And she was actually not blamed, I think, in Hungary for the extinction or for the enduring the dynasty to die out because they were so young.
Yes, they were young, so I guess they weren't married for very long.
Yes, we don't really know about this. And since we didn't know whether they were bride or married, we don't know who was she, what happened with her after that. And since they were 24 years old, they could have been married for 10 years or 8 years or 2 years or nothing. But in the Hungarian chronicles, it was not the woman who was blamed, but the early death of Emeric was blamed for the war, not their barren marriage.
Of course, we couldn't blame Stephen for not having many more sons.
Yes.
Dori, unfortunately we're running out of time, so this is going to have to be my last question about Emeric and the chaste kings. You said Emeric was buried at Székesfehérvár where his father, King Istvan, was also buried. Did it become a place of pilgrimage?
Yes, it became a place of pilgrimage. For example, we have the legend of these holy kings, and it was written that their canonization was such a huge event, and many people arrived there, and there were miracles which happened. And actually these miracles were that famous that there is a writer, Bernard of Constance, and he even writes in his contemporary chronicle that the fame of the miracle reached even him. So many pilgrims went there, and there is a very interesting story in the legend of Saint Emeric that German knight went there, and he was a pilgrim because he committed a very huge sin. Probably he slayed one of his relatives, and the Pope gave him a penitence that he must visit all the pilgrim sites. He even went to Jerusalem, but he was not absolved. There were a huge chains on him until he reached Székesfehérvár, and he went to the tomb of Emeric, and his sins was forgiven and the chains disappeared.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yes, it's a very nice story. And we have some sources from the Middle Ages that their tombs were venerated, and it was a pilgrimage site. And some of the kings was buried them right after the tombs of St. Stephen. So it was a very important sacral place. And actually it was a very important place for the Hungarians, because at the end of the Middle Ages, a king must have been canonized there. It was one of the sacral center of Hungary. And, it was a very huge loss that because of the Ottoman invasion, we lost many things and many relics. But it was a very important place for the Hungarians.
I always think of the pilgrims as the early tourists, which obviously they were. And therefore, if you can have a few saints in your town or by your monastery, it's extremely good business.
Yes, actually, there is... They think that in the canonization of Edward, the Confessor, one of the reasons was that the Westminster Abbey wanted to have a saint for himself, and it should be a route of pilgrimage.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yes, absolutely. Good business. And on that interesting saintly note, I think we're going to have to leave it there because we have completely run out of time. Dori, thank you so much for coming back into CEU and talking to me and the Meeson audience about Emeric and his chaste marriage.
Thank you so much for the invitation, and thank you so much for listening me.
Oh, it's been fun. I've enjoyed it. Today I have been talking to Dorottya Uhrin about her research into St. Emeric and his chaste marriage. My thanks to everyone for listening. I hope you found it as interesting and enjoyable as I did. I certainly found it totally fascinating. Please do look out for the next Meeson podcast, in which Meeson members and associates talk about their current or recent research into the medieval world of Central Europe. And if you have research that you or your colleagues are doing, and you would like to talk about it to Meeson, please do contact me through the Meeson board or website administrator. In the meantime, I'm Karen Culver for the Meeson podcast. Thank you and goodbye.